Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today, we will discuss the cashew markets, looking at the various signals so far and the complex nature of the cashew market. The session is available in both French and English, and you can select your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom left side of your screen. The session is also streaming live on our official ACA Facebook page and YouTube channels. You can follow from there. The GMA is an interactive session, and so we encourage you to ask your questions or leave your comments in the Q&A box. We will make time to answer as many as possible. Before I hand over to Jim, this webinar is made possible by the kind support of our partners and sponsors. And so we appreciate the support of the European Union, EU, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Also to remind you that the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will take place in Accra, Ghana in September. Get ready to be part of the biggest cashew event in Africa. Online registration has started, and so we encourage you to visit www.africancashewalliance.com to register now. Good morning, Jim. How are you doing?
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, Jim.
Well, that's good. I've just confirmed that you can see my screen, this slide. I had a few technical problems this morning.
Yes, I can see your screen
Okay, that's good.
and the slides as well.
Great.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Over to you.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome again. We're going to talk about my favorite subject, the cashew market. And today I've just entitled it Mixed Signals, Complex Markets, because the signals right now are pretty difficult to read. And there are so many different things going on, particularly outside influences on this market, which is never easy to read, and today becomes even more difficult. Let's start off with a few pointers on what we're going to talk about. So my estimate of the crop is slightly lower this week from 2 weeks ago. The crops in West Africa are slow to arrive, particularly the second crop in Côte d'Ivoire and probably two, I think, in Guinea. That reflects earlier experience this year in Ghana in particular, and to a lesser extent in Benin too. Farm gate prices are steady. Mostly in West Africa, they are managed by regulators. They don't always stick to those regulations, but they are relatively steady. In India and in Cambodia, they are easing back a little bit as the crop starts to flow. But the international prices of raw cashew nuts, the offered prices at least, are unchanged. There isn't a huge amount of business going on, so the mechanism for change in price isn't really there for now. On the other side, the imports of raw cashew nuts to India and to Vietnam are ahead of last year, which is interesting given the late arrival of the crop and probably suggests that there has been something of a hangover from the 2025 crop into 2026. More of that later. Cashew kernels prices are steady. Some of the offers have been marked up a little in the course of the last week or so. That's not surprising given the cost factors. Export volume, and we'll have a good look at the Vietnamese export volumes. That's the earliest signal we get in terms of the export demand. We'll have a look at those, and they're pretty positive so far. But questions remain, particularly on demand, particularly around the impact of higher energy prices, the war in the Middle East, and all of the economic fallout from that. Of course, it's anyone's guess right now when that will end, but we'll have a look and take a couple of assumptions as to whether it might be short or long and what impacts that might have. So quite a few factors to look at. Not a great deal of volatility in the market, but a lot of different volatile factors at play, making this rather difficult to understand and making the signals mixed, but also complex. So let's dive into it. Let's start and have a look at the supply situation for 2026. So we'll take a look at here's the world supply situation, just to remind you that West Africa produced about 50% of the world's cashews in 2025, Cambodia 16%, India 13%. So production is relatively concentrated, although West Africa is a huge area, obviously, with many different countries producing. So when we look at this, we're seeing a situation that we need to look at the countries. So we're going to start with Cambodia. And what I understand is Cambodia, that yes, the crop was impacted by rains during November and December. That probably means a longer harvest season. It'll drag on into May, maybe even into June. But on the other hand, the imports by Vietnam from Cambodia are up by 13%. So that's, on the one hand, we get signals from Cambodia that the crop may be a little bit less than expected. And I say expected rather than forecast because there isn't really a forecast. But the trade is bigger volume. Now that's a bit like last year where we were told from Cambodia that the crop was late and maybe small, but it turned out that the crop was big, although it did arrive a little bit later. Now, prices tend not to lie, and prices have been falling. So that to me is an indicator that that Cambodian crop is heading up. Maybe it won't make the million tons this year again, but it's heading up in that direction. Relatively optimistic on that. Farmers did well early, with some of those who had raw nuts did well early. The prices were really high. They've slipped back a little bit. Vietnam is a much smaller producer, of course, about 5% of the world's production, but it's important nonetheless. Still a positive forecast, and the weather conditions right now are good for a continuation of the harvest, which is well on its way, if not reaching toward the end of that cycle. So in Southeast Asia, to begin with, relatively optimistic outlook. I think we have to add about Cambodia is that although we may see yields impacted following the heavy rains at flowering, there are continually more and more hectares coming online in Cambodia. That's going to continue for this year, probably for next year. And after that, it'll slow down. So the growth rate in Cambodia is slowing down, but it's slowing down from a huge 33% average growth from 2019 for the following 4 years. So we're looking now at slowing growth in Cambodia, but still a big crop and still growth. I mean, the level of growth is still pretty impressive. What about India? Well, it's early days for India. If we look at the forecasts, we hear figures around about 780,000 tons, up as high as 795,000 tons. Weather's been a little bit mixed lately. The crop is coming in now in some areas. And in India, the crop is spread over a wide area these days, all the way from the very south of the subcontinent, right up through Orissa, right up to the northeast. So when we look at that, we're looking at a much longer harvest period than we might have been in past years. Mixed weather conditions lately. I looked at the Indian weather reports and I see that the rainfall deficit in the southwest, so the southwest is Kerala, and an excess in the east. So that means up through Tamil Nadu, up along the coastal provinces up to Andhra Pradesh. So we're looking here at probably, I think, a decent crop in India. No reason for alarm. Keep an eye on the weather. Looking a little bit more closely then into West Africa, and we go through some of the larger countries, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea-Bissau in particular. So looking at Nigeria, trade forecasts still optimistic. Maybe not as big as last year, maybe about 10% below last year. That hasn't changed. The weather is mixed for the ongoing harvest period, but that's normal. Prices at the farm gate, I'm surprised by the prices at the farm gate. They are high. Um, Higher than I would have thought could be sustained, but I'm wondering about some of the information on that. And there are high arrivals from Nigeria in Vietnam. So there may be, I think on one side, there's probably some Nigerian material being released from transit warehouses from old crop, but there's also an emphasis from buyers with destinations in Vietnam to look at Nigeria. It's a free market. You can buy, you can export, as opposed to Cote d'Ivoire, where they had something of a difficult experience back in 2024, if you remember. Speaking of Cote d'Ivoire, again, I've marked back the estimate of the crop simply based on its lateness. Um, so I'm now down, I've marked it down. It's big in the numbers, of course, because we're looking last year at 1.5, just under 1.55 million tons. And even if you mark that down by 10%, it's a big number. But so far, processors, exporters, it looks like about 800,000 tons has been harvested. That's towards the end of last week. That includes some old crop that would have been mixed in. Um, that's always going to happen. When you get a big crop, you don't have the infrastructure to get it to market on time. The second crop, and the main concern now is that the second crop is delayed, but I understand it's likely to be decent in terms of its volume. We are expecting, of course, that the yields, the average outturn will be much more like a 2023 or 2024 crop than the really super figures that were seen last year. So lower volumes, farm gate price is steady. That won't be everywhere, of course, but we're talking to people who observe the rules, if you like, and there you'll find the market between 400, 425. Farmers would like more, but it doesn't look like they're going to get it right now. And it would be very difficult to justify paying any more than that looking at the cashew kernels market. So the buyers, particularly export buyers, are awaiting new arrivals. Export prices steady. Export offers steady, not too much trade. I think this crop looks okay. It's still at risk, of course. There is always a risk until it's harvested, but it looks volume-wise a pretty good crop that, comparing to any other year except last year, would be regarded as an excellent crop in terms of its volume. A little bit disappointing on the quality, given the positive experience of last year. Looking at Guinea-Bissau,
Is it urgent?
so Guinea-Bissau is the third.
Which people?
This federal mission of
Okay.
payment
If you wouldn't mind muting your microphones, please.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Which people?
Federal mission of labor training.
Okay.
You tell him
Maybe
the manager is not around.
ACA, you could look after that microphone, please,
he
and
will
mute
call
it for
you.
us.
You tell him that the manager is not around. You call the manager, Mr. Rohit, which speak with you. He will call you back because he is not around. Okay. Even if you will enter the gate, I will sit inside the room. Okay.
Someone likes to do their business in public with an open mic. Okay. Where was I? We were talking about Guinea-Bissau, or we were about to. Guinea-Bissau, definitely not as big a crop as last year, just looking at the weather. It's still possible, of course. Last year we looked at about 300,000 tons. Not all of that goes through the port of Bissau, so if you look at the export figures, you won't see that. But that's taking into account plenty of material that went through Senegal. So that means lower than last year by about 10% or so. Reference price unchanged. The crop has started, but it's not yet flowing. There are some concerns, or there were some concerns voiced about 4 weeks ago on the situation that the crop might be impacted by some rains. Haven't heard that in the meantime. So for the time being, we're looking at this 270,000 tons or thereabouts, plus or minus. That's a pretty good crop by any standards, actually, given over the last 10 years or so. So in the major producers in West Africa, volume-wise, pretty okay. Quality-wise, Côte d'Ivoire a little bit disappointing, but certainly not a crop that's as good as last year, but nonetheless still looks pretty okay. Elsewhere in West Africa, Ghana coming to close now. Price is relatively steady. It's very difficult to place prices in Ghana because quality has been variable this year. It's certainly below typical Ghanaian quality, and the situation is a little bit confusing. We wouldn't expect to see the crop too much below average. One of the issues here is that the crop estimates, some of the official crop estimates, are probably a little bit on the high side, and they're a little bit on the high side probably because so much material flows in from Cote d'Ivoire, and it flows naturally across rivers, across the border, to the ports in Ghana, although that's not legal from an Ivorian point of view. So coming to the end, probably still some material to be sold by traders. Quality, not as good as usual, but it's still not a bad quality. Benin, so Benin is a really, it's a really strange situation. You have an export ban. Over the last 2 years, there's been plenty of export illegally. And now the culture around that is changing. It's now being openly spoken about. So before, people would talk of origins like Benin, Nigeria, or like Benin, or Togo, Benin, and now they just say, yeah, we can get you Benin or Siena. And the smugglers are exporters, whatever way you want to call them. They're highly active in the market and probably just as well from a farmer's point of view because they are supporting the farm gate price. So farm gate prices are lower. There's no minimum price in Benin this year. You have now no minimum price. You have a border where it's impossible, I think it's fair to say impossible at this point, to enforce the export ban. And you have processors who are progressing, and some of them doing a really good job, but they're not able to absorb the entire crop. But they were never expected to absorb the entire crop, and therefore this situation arises. So you can buy Benin product in the international market. It is, of course, shipped from Benin illegally. And whether or not the government can clamp down on that, and whether or not that would be a good thing from the farmer's point of view, remains to be seen. But for now, it seems to me at least that there is a reasonable crop, probably lower than well, it's probably significantly lower than the official estimates. I saw numbers as high as 250,000 tons earlier in the year. I don't see that at all. I think it's probably 160, certainly less than 200,000, probably less than last year as a crop, but not significantly so, more like an average typical crop. Now, there is one thing to be considered here on the longer run. What will the impact be of lower farm gate prices and smuggling on farmers? And what will the impact be on their ability to manage their trees and to improve their production yields in the coming years? So keep an eye on Benin. I don't think there will be any change in the regulations, but there certainly needs to be some system to make sure that farmers don't suffer through a lack of market in the future. Burkina Faso, interesting situation. Farm gate prices very high. Someone mentioned to me recently heading up towards 600 CFA per kilo, which compared to 425 in Cote d'Ivoire is obviously a big price. They're ruling high. As I understand it, the processors are not participating in that. They're not pushing it on. The export window should officially have opened by now, but I'm just wondering if there wouldn't be an extension to that in order to allow processors to do their business and to allow farmers to work with the processors. Definitely exports will be a little bit delayed this year. And it's difficult to see how these farm gate prices can be sustained given the international market and given the international market for cashew kernels too. Don't forget, some of the prices in Burkina are distorted. There's significant organic cashews there. And of course, organic cashews make premiums. They make significant premiums. And some of the prices mentioned may be distorted by the fact that they're organic nuts. If we look in the Republic of Guinea, the original forecast around about 150,000 tons, that would have been a pretty good crop. it's grown quickly in recent years. That growth seems to have slowed a little bit now. There was, again, some cross-border trade from Côte d'Ivoire, which maybe distorted the figures earlier. I think around about 150,000 tons is about right. But the second crop is late, especially around Cancan, a major production area. A little bit better, I understand, in Bokeh. But that means it's going to be difficult. If that crop is there, and there's no reason to think it's not there, but it is certainly late, that makes it difficult for traders. So a late crop has a lot of impacts in the market. It has impact of depriving the market of cash. It has an impact of potentially causing farmers to work on other things and forget about their cashews. It can affect the quality, and of course it increases the risk. Now, I'm not being alarmist. I do not think there's any major problem, but I do think we need to keep a close eye on it. So let's have a look at our overall West Africa conclusions. As I mentioned, we've marked down our estimate of the crop a little bit. We're looking at a reduction of our estimate of about 4.8% on the high estimate. So let's say the high estimate, the optimistic side, has come back a little bit. So we're less optimistic that the crop will be a big crop. It'll be an average crop. And on the low estimate side, or the pessimistic side, we've only dropped our estimate back by about, well, less than 1%. So it's not a big change in that sense. I think that the risk of it being a very small crop or a really problematic crop is disappearing, but it is also less likely that this will turn out in the end to be one of those very big crops like last year. Signals there are difficult, and these are one of the mixed signals. I mentioned one earlier. This is the second area where there's really mixed signals. There is a possibility as the year goes on that farmers will start to focus on their food crops, and they will focus less on cashews, that the product will come more slowly to market. That could cause traders, particularly local traders, to misread the situation, thinking that there's no cashews, when in fact what's happening is they're just coming more slowly to the market. So many people have looked at this and said, let's go slow. Let's not add any fuel to the fire by engaging in the market. Let's wait and see. And I think that's what's happening across West Africa now. The other risk is that regulators look at the situation and again, misread it and have difficulty enforcing prices. So if product is lower quality, and usually if it's later, it's lower quality. If it comes to market as lower quality, this puts pressure on the farm gate regulatory prices, the minimums or the guide prices. And that could cause as has happened in the past, that could cause a knee-jerk reaction from regulators. Let's hope not. So what we're looking at is the general variation, let's say, and the reason why our high estimate is down is almost entirely due to a revision of the estimate for Côte d'Ivoire. Moving that down a little bit, it's quite a cautious estimate now based on the crop being a little bit later. Next move, our next estimates will be based on the arrival of the second crop or the second flush in Côte d'Ivoire and in the Republic of Guinea. And if we see positive news there, we might be looking at an estimate toward the higher end. Either way, not a huge revision, but certainly a more cautious one from 2 weeks ago. What does that mean for world production? Well, basically, if we look at it, we see that most of the variation. So I've done a 3-year trend here over 23, 24, 25, and then added in a little forecast for 2026. So what we're seeing around the world is not much variation in Indonesia, East Africa, or Brazil, not much variation in Vietnam and Cambodia. Again, in India, probably a slightly better crop than last year, but the variation or the volatility in the estimates is all about West Africa. And that means that our world production is reduced a little from the last time we talked. It's reduced by about 4.5%. That's on the optimistic side, but there is a 7% variation between the optimistic and the pessimistic So as the season goes on, the variation becomes narrower. 7% would still be quite a high margin. I have to add also that the lower quality, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, but this mainly focuses on West Africa, this comment that the lower quality will magnify the impact of a smaller harvest than last year. Obviously, if you're getting 46 pounds instead of 48 pounds, you get less cashew kernels from that. West African crops would be the main focus for risk at this moment. Generally speaking, the reports on the ground are quite positive. So people are expecting those second crops to arrive in good volume. They are expecting good crops in later cropping areas like Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Gambia. And I think probably at the end of the day, we're not far off having an accurate estimate of the coming crop. So let's have a look at the other side of the supply picture. Let's have a look at the imports into Vietnam and into India. So if we look at this chart, let me explain it a little bit. We have January, February, March. We have the cumulative imports. So January plus February, January plus February plus March. The green bars are 2026 and the lines are the previous years. So if we just compare to 2025, by the end of March, Vietnam had imported about 565,000 tons. By the end of March this year, that equivalent number was 731,000 tons. So the imports of raw cashew nuts into Vietnam in the first quarter are up by 29%, which is a new record. And that's quite interesting because last year was also a very positive year. If we look at the origins of that product, we see a few interesting factors. We see Cambodia, despite the fact that there are some concerns on the Cambodian cropper, there certainly were a couple of weeks ago, that the actual arrivals are strongly up. We see arrivals from Cote d'Ivoire up also, but that must be all crop material. We see arrivals from Nigeria. Wow, what growth, huge growth in the imports from Nigeria. And that is also probably the release of some old crop that was stored in the ports in Vietnam. But it was also more of an emphasis on buying in Vietnam, in Nigeria, by Vietnamese traders and their processor customers. And also in Tanzania, we have seen over the last 4 or 5 years an increasing interest in buying in Tanzania. So if we go back about 5, 6 years, Vietnam tended to look for value, tended to look for lower prices and wasn't overly concerned about lower quality. So lower quality from parts of Nigeria, although that's changed, parts of Cote d'Ivoire were the most popular, and the Vietnamese buyers or the traders that supply them would be seen active in the market early. Now with more and more interest in Tanzanian raw cashew nuts from Vietnam due to, I suppose, some of the supply disappointments they had. I won't say supply shocks, I'll say supply disappointments and the realization of the vulnerability to the early part of the West African harvest. Perhaps Vietnamese buyers looked more at Tanzania, perhaps they looked more at quality, and there they found it. And you can see that the imports by Vietnam from Tanzania have stepped up in recent years, and that looks like a pattern that's set to continue as Tanzanian production continues to grow. So this is telling us a couple of things. I feel it's telling us, one, that there was significant old crop material carried over, and it's telling us that Cambodian shipments contradict the storyline of a poor crop in Cambodia. So that generally would be an indicator of positive supply in Vietnam in the early part of this year. It would also indicate one of the reasons why Vietnamese buyers may be more slow to enter the market, particularly when raw cashew nut prices are out of line with kernels prices. If they have inventory, they have time. And perhaps that's what we're looking at. That's not to say that they can stay out of the market for too long. Vietnam last year imported almost 3 million tons, so there's still a long way to go in this season. What about India? Well, here we have Indian month-by-month imports, 4 years, 23, 24, 25, and so far in 26. You can see 2026, the yellow bars, 2025, the red. So let's start by looking at the end of 2025. So here we have November and December 2025. And you see that December was low month for imports. November was lower than previous years. Why was that? Well, probably because the Tanzanian auction started that little bit later. But in January, all of that ground's been made up and more. So January, very positive month for imports into India. A lot of that will have come from Tanzania, but not only Tanzania. And February too, very strong compared to last year. I think that is a record February. In fact, last year, if we think about this, last year was the second biggest import after 2022 into India. And it wasn't far behind 2022 either. And now we're seeing a very positive sign at the beginning of the year. So certainly entering the season, there was optimism in India. Now we'll look in a few minutes what the political developments since then have meant and how that might impact demand across the world. But certainly coming into the season, you would have thought that Indian processors, having had record imports last year, albeit they also had some exports of raw cashew nuts to Vietnam, that they will have had a very positive attitude. So again, you would not, looking at this, suggest that there's any real tightness of supply in India. But again, Indian buyers will want to build up, and you can see that imports, so we're talking here about imports. So if it arrives in March, it must have been shipped probably January. So you're looking at the peak months towards the middle of the year, June, July, August, in time for the key consumption periods in the last quarter of the year in India. So we would be expecting that Indian buyers need to come to market rest of this month and May to start to supplement their supplies. During that period, they'd also get a better idea of their own harvest size and they'll be able to adjust accordingly. Complicating factor is, of course, that the Indian rupee's been pretty weak. That makes life more difficult for processors who mainly import to process and sell within India, unlike their Vietnamese counterparts who import in dollars and sell in dollars. So this makes it more complex for Indian processors. And of course, the additional question marks over the state of the Indian economies worldwide actually, but in this case, the Indian economy and how it might be impacted by higher energy costs as a result of the war in the Middle East, and especially the problems in the Strait of Hormuz. So supply side conclusions then, the crop is a bit lower than last year, but not too far off an average crop. It's definitely later. That means risk. Inventories and imports so far adequate for the time of year. Crops in Asia, so we mean Cambodia, India, Vietnam to a lesser extent, positive. But there are risk factors, and those risk factors are related to the later crop, particularly Cote d'Ivoire, Republic of Guinea, and to a lesser extent, Guinea-Bissau. So not a particularly negative picture, certainly no reason to start thinking of any change in the overall surplus position that the cashew nut market's been in for several years. And really the question mark would be, why are raw cashew nut prices managing to hold the current levels in this supply situation? And I feel that's probably just to do with timing. So let's have a look at the other side. Let's have a look at demand side, and we'll have a look at the cashew kernels markets. Current situation is, generally speaking, I think there's a steadier tone in the market, relatively neutral sentiment. People are asking the question rather than expecting a movement. Vietnamese prices. Vietnam is the supplier of cashew kernels to the world, and Vietnam is stable in a relatively narrow range. I think we've seen prices I think I've seen about around 317 offered, up to 335. I have seen higher from top quality shippers or for the Chinese market. That'd be over 340 for 320s. We always talk about 320s as the benchmark grade. What we did notice in the last week or so is that the top processors marked up their prices. The gap widened between the top, who are often the better financed, the better organized processors, and lower level processors. That can be about quality, it can be about reliability, it can be about finance. When that gap widens, it's often a signal that the market is strengthening a little bit. And it probably is strengthening a little bit, but I don't think there's any real volatility expected. So we're about 9% above the 5-year average, 9.5%. We've been there for some time. We are just under the 2-year average. Relatively stable market conditions that will encourage buyers. We're not yet seeing any impact of any global political instability in these prices. In West Africa, the second largest supplying area to the export markets, prices for 320 still between 345 and 355. If you've got a special product, special quality, if you've got a traceable product, you can expect prices above that again, up to 370 plus for some of the really best material around. And I think that that's likely to be maintained. Buyers are more and more likely to look for diversification of their supply chains in the current conditions. Conclusion from all of that is, of course, that there are very few open contracts above today's market price. This removes one of the key, I call them the multipliers of volatility. In other words, those things that can make the market go very high, very quick, or very low, very quick. And the fact that there are contracts in or around about today's market, but not above it, means that there's very little chance of defaults, very little chance of problems on the contract side. I think probably we could say the market's looking for direction at the moment. Now, where will it find it? I think we look at the upside and we look at the downside. And if we look at the upside, I think they're mostly cost factors. So you've got the cost of raw cashew nuts, question marks about the crop in West Africa, and they're only question marks, let's be clear. Cost of energy, which is a fact and will be with us for some time. The fact that prices are in a relatively sustainable range from the point of view of consumers, roasters, processors. There might be some questions for farmers around about some of the farm gate prices. The open buyer positions, which are average, probably nothing, no great exposure in those right now, and strong exports from Vietnam, as we'll have a look at a little bit later. These are all factors that point toward the market remaining pretty steady. On the downside, we're much more talking about unknowns. So when we look at the upside, these are knowns. We know RCN cost, we know energy costs are high, we know that we're in a sustainable price change, we know about open buyer positions, we know that exports have been strong. On the downside, we're in much more unknowns. We do not know yet what the impact of war on demand generally will be. So that's the economic impact of the war and the economic impact of demand in markets. So we might know that the Middle Eastern market for the last month, probably for the months of March and April, the Middle Eastern market will be really badly impacted in terms of shipments and consumption. But we do not know the key markets, those key and particularly price-sensitive markets, China, the US, India, maybe less price sensitive, but we do not know the impact on those markets as yet. And it's not a clear picture because we have lots of different tree nuts as well, moving in different directions. Problems with the shipment of pistachio nuts from Iran, clearly that could impact cashews. So it's a lot of mixed signals here. We do know at the moment that the Indian rupee is weak against the US dollar, which increases the cost of Indian imports of raw cashew nuts. India imports about 60% of its raw cashew nuts. And we know that the Indian rupee is at a weak level right now. Currency markets can change quickly. if there was to be a lasting peace in the Middle East, this whole situation could turn around. But it's what would happen if there is a lasting peace, or even if there's an agreement, is that all these downside question marks would tend to disappear. The impact of war on demand, it would be there, but it would be less. The impact of the loss of the Middle Eastern market, yes, it would be there, but it would be much shorter. The Indian rupee might recover. The dollar generally has not been that strong, but it has been strong against the Indian currency. So if we get a settlement, let's hope we get a settlement, but if we do, it's more likely that the downside factors are eliminated. I don't think, on the other hand, that there's enough in the upside to really start any kind of a sustained price movement upwards. There's enough supply, demand is good, buyers are interested in these prices, but they're not interested to chase the market up. And the recovery of demand in markets like the US or growth in China would be short-lived if prices were to spark upwards. So let's have a look in at those prices and just see if we can make any sense and see what they might mean. So I've done a couple of charts on this. And so first of all, we've looked at over the last 7 years, the highs, that's the black triangle, the lows joined up by the red line, and the closing price, which is the green dots. This again is for WW320s, FOB, high, low, and close annually. Most of these prices relate to Vietnam. So we go by we go by mid-range processors in Vietnam normally. So we take the lowest origin of a medium risk, medium quality product. What we can draw from this is that the market, with one exception, 2024, has been in a narrow range for each of those 6 or 7 years. And that's interesting because despite 3 major crises in that period, crisis 1 was COVID, crisis 2 was 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fallout that had for energy prices and economies, most acutely felt in Europe, much more felt in Western economies than in Asian economies or in African economies, but nonetheless a significant factor. Then we saw the only volatile year of recent years, and even that volatile period was really just second half of April through to the end of May. So about a 6 to 7 week period of volatility. And that was a correction. I'd maintain that prices never should have gone to the lows they saw in 21, 22, 23. And we've seen relative stability since then. So when we look at that, and we just have a look at this again in a different way, here's a line chart month by month, again, 320s FOB. And, you know, if we look at this, what we're seeing is that the market tends to close in recent years at the season's lows. So it tends to close very close to or at the low price of the season. So the season for me is a calendar year when it comes to price and demand analysis. And we see that in 21, 22, 23, 25 and 2026, the market closed the end of December either at the low price of the year or close to it. And I think we can draw some conclusions for that. And if we want to have another look, we can just say when were the season highs? And in most years, season's highs were mid-year. In most years, the market closed, in fact, all years, 7 of 7, the market closed below the season highs. Now, the conclusions I would draw from that are, one, that we have a market that's in a fundamental oversupply situation. It has been since Cambodia's production surge. But from the start of the 50% that's harvested in West Africa through to the end of the year, it's very difficult to see what's happening. The market lacks any kind of transparency, and the market has a long and dysfunctional raw materials supply chain. And we see that when we see products still being delivered at the end of February and even into March from the old crop. So looking at this situation, we're looking at a market that is not actually coping very well with the surplus situation, but is managing to hold prices at relatively stable levels over the past 2 years. That's interesting, but it does suggest the possibility of some volatility in the future. Not this year. I'm pretty sure not this year, but maybe in years to come. So let's have a look at those three factors. We'll have a look at the surplus position, we'll have a look at the transparency, and we'll have a look at the dysfunctional raw materials supply chain that is cashews. First of all, let's look at the surplus position. So what we've seen over a long period of time is a growth in production. So really since 2018. Now, 2018, we saw a surplus, but that was because the high prices of the previous years damaged demand growth. So we saw a surplus starting to emerge. But by 2020, 2021, Cambodia came on stream. Big growth in production, and now particularly Cote d'Ivoire, but also think about it, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Burkina, almost all countries in West Africa grew their production. And now in the last 2 years, we've seen Tanzania also join that party and start to grow its production really quickly. So we're in a surplus position because demand is growing at just under 5% and production is growing at just over 7% over the last 10 years or so. When we go back to 2015, 2016, when we saw those really high prices, we saw a minor crop problem, a minor deficit create a record price rise. But when we get on later, we see Cambodia emerges and surges, West Africa continues its trend, and production grows. Meantime, three crises. Now, it's interesting because crisis one, COVID actually caused cashew consumption to increase. 2021 was a remarkable year for consumption growth. But 2022, second half of particularly, caused a contraction in demand, particularly in Western markets at that time, because those were most impacted by the price of, particularly the price of gas. And now we're seeing, and we don't know the answer to this yet, but now we're seeing a relatively balanced supply demand based on estimates. They, of course, are only estimates. Position and what's next? Well, we don't know. Let's have a think about it. 2019, we saw a surge in demand. We saw prices 2022, 2023 eventually come quite low. In fact, 16-year lows, if you recall. We saw a real, in my view, a real overreaction to the situation in Ukraine, particularly from Vietnamese processors. They knocked prices down. We got down, if you recall, to $2.45. It seems a long way and a long time ago now. And that persisted until we got a price correction in 2024. Now, you could say, as some might say, that that was due to the restriction on exports from Cote d'Ivoire, but that restriction lasted 2 months. That restriction was not the reason. The reason was that prices were simply too low. That correction happened because the 2024 crop was a little bit lower. Demand was growing quickly. And then delivery of that crop to processors in Europe, and that's where we talk about the dysfunctional supply chain. Delivery of that product to processors in Vietnam and India was delayed. So 2026, what will be the reaction? It does look a little bit like 2024, but prices are not at 16-year lows. They're right on the average. And for that reason, you might start to say, well, there's not really any reason here for prices to move up. And if you said that, I would agree with you. Let's have a look at the second factor, the lack of transparency. And to me, this is probably a greater cause of volatility. So if we look, first of all, lack of transparency, inaccurate production forecasts. So in this little chart, what you can see is estimates of the crop forecasts right across the main producing regions. So we're comparing original official crop estimates with either the actual crop outturn or the current estimate. And basically what we see is that in East Africa, And West Africa, especially, the estimates really exaggerate the level of production. And that is misleading. And that makes it more difficult and it causes people to react in the market. This may impact farmers more than anyone else, but it certainly impacts the market. Second lack of transparency is when you look at raw cashew nut prices on any given day for the last 5 years and look at cashew kernel prices on any given day for the last 5 years, you cannot find a single day where there was a direct parity between the raw cashew nut price and the cashew kernels price. There is always a time lag. There is always a differential in pricing or quality or transit or freight or tax or export windows, you name it. And this creates a complete lack of transparency. There's never a day where you can say, if I bought Nigerian raw cashew nuts this morning, put them into my process when they arrived, if I sold them at the same time, so I bought them this morning and sold them this afternoon, would I make a profit margin? No, you would not, generally speaking, no matter how good a processor you were. So there's always that time lag, and that encourages a speculative culture. It's a very difficult way to do business. That's mainly in relation to the international kernels market. It's a bit different if you just compare it to the Indian kernels market, which trades at premium prices. There certainly have been days where that parity existed for the Indian domestic market for kernels. Third factor is mixed signals, vested interests, as I call it. And I'll just focus in on this one a little bit because this is something I've discussed on this event before. And generally what we've got is poor market information systems. We've got a situation where poor market information systems leaves a vacuum. Everyone, everywhere, but they always do, and that's nothing new, talks their own position, their own book. If they're long, they talk it up. If they're short, they talk it down. But into this, we can add poor official sources of information. We can add more recently, and it's been most noticeable in the last 3 months, a lot of AI generated junk online, which is based on, the problem with all information technology is that if you put bad information in, you will get poor conclusions out. And that's what happens in our industry. So we have a complex situation, and it's not always that people are trying to manipulate the market. They are very often genuinely trying to spread good market information and analysis, but they just don't have the tools. And this is a problem. So it creates a lack of transparency. And the final aspect is to look at the over and under reaction to small moves in supply and demand. So I would still maintain that the factor that characterizes where we are today is the middle of the last decade, the huge price surge that happened at that time. But it wasn't really related to a major shortage of cashew nuts. It wasn't related to fundamentals. It was a speculative bubble. It crashed afterwards, and as time went on, as Cambodia came in, we saw first of all an overreaction to the increase in production in Cambodia. We saw a very little development of new demand, although demand movement was very positive, but it's not by no means solid. So we saw last year China grow very quickly, but that could also change. And we'll have a look at that shortly too. So a lack of transparency can create price volatility. The third factor is our long and dysfunctional supply chain. And if you regularly attend this event, you've heard me talk about this before. So first factor is it's huge. It's 4.3 million tons last year, about $6.5 billion of value. The product flows, but the information does not. It's either selective, it's intentional. In other words, it's released for specific impact to create particular consequences. The processors, generally speaking, especially in Vietnam, the processors are not well directly connected to the producers because the producers are in Africa, they are in Vietnam or in India, and there are intermediaries in between. Now, there are processors in India who are very well connected. There are some in Vietnam, but they're few and far between. And as processing has changed in India, as the crop has moved area and as production or processing rather has moved toward the northern parts of the country, that connection is actually weakened. Third factor is the processors, especially Vietnamese processors, sell forward. They sell forward because they have to sell forward because that's what their buyers need in order to buy from them. But they cannot cover that risk. They have to take a chance. They have to wait till the crop is available. So someone may sell in October for 6, 8, 12 months forward and not be able to buy that product in until February, March, April, May, and maybe not receive delivery of it until 2 or 3 months after that. So this creates a situation where, in theory, processors in Vietnam start every season short. That's why the arrival of Cambodia as a major supplier has reduced their risk, although it's increased their needs in other areas, cash flow particularly. A key factor that I always look at is that the supply of money. Our raw cashew nut supply chain, the international one, is funded by traders. They advance into the sourcing countries. They pay deposits, they open letters of credit, they pay against documents. If they starve that market of cash, or if they have to, or if they think the market demands that they should, that impacts prices. A lack of cash causes prices to go down. Farmers want to sell for cash. And this is the interface between the smallholder, especially in West Africa, and the international chain. It's a cash business. If there's no cash, prices will go down. And this, you get this strain then because regulators try to set prices at a certain level, say 400 CFA in Cote d'Ivoire this year. But if there's not enough money to support that, it's very, very difficult to support it. On the other hand, if there's too much money in the system, and this you see in Ghana almost every year, a cash injection, too much money chasing too little product can cause a speculative price bubble. So you'd see a mini speculative price bubble in many years in Ghana. We saw it in 2025. It was less this year because the crop was slower and more even. But when it happens, you get a bubble. And what happens with bubbles? Well, we all know what happens with bubbles. They burst. So this control of cash, this is also part of this dysfunctional supply chain. And the reason I'm highlighting this today is, of course, because we're trying to talk about the actuals, the production, the demand, but all of these factors can intervene to distort those fundamentals and create a different direction for the market than might have been expected. And unfortunately, many, many cashew kernels buyers globally are just not informed on the supply chain. That's not because they don't want to be. It's because it's difficult, number one. Number two, it's complex. Production and processing are isolated from each other. And number three, in many cases, they buy multiple products. You can find out what you want about almonds. You can find out pretty much what you want about hazelnuts or dried fruit. Try to find out what's going on cashews. It takes real effort. So we have this fractured supply chain, and that's the third factor that influences the situation and can distort the market. So how might this impact this year? How might this impact the market in 2026? So I think the first aspect is that the lack of crop information, the poor forecasts and confusing numbers after that has made processors generally cautious, particularly in Vietnam, but generally everywhere. They tend, therefore, to focus on the more accessible origins. Cambodia is accessible for Vietnamese buyers because it's nearby. Even though it's high quality, high price, it makes much more sense. Nigeria is accessible in the sense that there's no processor window, there's no taxation. You can go in and buy early in the season, and if you need to buy, it's a good place to go from that point of view. It also, to come back to the point, impacts the cash in the system. So there's less cash in the system. That creates a lower incentive to collect. It may mean that farmers move on to other products food products, particularly as the year goes on, it may mean that the traders that would be the local traders, the Pisteur in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, who would be essential to this system, they have less incentive to get involved in cashews and might move on to something else. So that can distort the flow of product. Regulatory systems under pressure, often self-inflicted because we bring in regulations that we cannot enforce and then we get pressure. And so this distorts the system, and this may well be one of the key factors in 2026. So if we take these things, we're going to see more cautious approach by processors, later arrival to the market, less cash in the system, and yet raw cashew nuts are still maintaining, at least at offered price level, still maintaining the prices. And it could be because the traders can build a book and defend a price. So if you know that the farm gate price can't go much lower, at least legally, you can build a book and try and defend that book. And that's an old-fashioned trader's way of looking at it. But it is a factor for many people. Is it likely to kick off price speculation in RCN this year? Personally, I do not think so. Is it possible another year? Very likely. In fact, for me, there's a key thing here going on, so that we have an increase in production. And the challenge now is becoming, actually, it used to be improving production, improving yields, improving quality. But I think as time goes on, as the volume grows, it's becoming more and more about actually getting raw cashew nuts from African countries to the market. And the market is the processors in Vietnam and India for most of the crop. And in doing so, preserving its quality and in time to meet orders. So we have a situation where we have a market that's essentially in surplus, but still maintains price. There is no real price impact of a surplus since 2024. And that's because of the costs, it's because of the complexity of the system, and it's because of the time taken to move those raw cashew nuts from all those tiny farms across West and East Africa to processing units in Vietnam or in India. It means that although there may be little volatility on the horizon, it means that the incentive is for sellers to hold prices. And this is probably the reason why they're holding prices at the moment. There's nothing to lose. There's no point in speculating until you know what's happening. You don't own it, so there's no point in defending it. Wait and see. What about kernels? Well, on the kernel side, I think the same situation. Poor information makes buyers cautious, but it also makes them more interested in diversifying their supply chain. So the situation this year is there is a noticeable uptick in the number of inquiries for African cashew kernels, despite higher prices. And that diversification of the supply chain is an essential element of risk management for processors, particularly for secondary processors, so we're talking roasters, and those processors need that product to be managed. So they need to know that if there's a problem with shipments from Vietnam, for example, that they can at least manage some of their product from West Africa or from East Africa. So we're seeing an uptick in the interest in diversifying the supply chain. We know there are higher costs. We know there are possible delays on shipments from Vietnam. I think that's obviously an impact of the higher oil price as a result of the war, and that is likely to continue. But it also probably means that the jeopardy to demand, the jeopardy generally to business created by these risky situations will mean a lower level of forward cover. So kernels buyers are less likely to do their normal long-term forward cover regardless of price. And I think we are seeing some of that already. Now, if we look at this, we see on the one side, supporting prices, higher costs. And also the lower crop, or at least lower than last year. On the other side, we see impact on demand or potential impact on demand of the economic consequences of higher energy prices. It could balance each other. So you could see a situation where actually we see very little price impact And I think that for me, that's probably the most likely outcome. I'm assuming that they will reach a long-term truce or agreement in the next few weeks. Demand will start to uptick again, but there will be an impact. And that actually that interruption to demand and particularly to forward buying will balance out a lower crop. So I'm sort of arguing here for very little to change, at least in the short to medium term. But in the longer term, definitely the higher dependence on Vietnam, the high dependence on Vietnam. Remember, Vietnam supplies 74% of the cashews to Europe, 89% to the United States, 94% to China. The high dependence on Vietnam is definitely in focus again amongst buyers, and they're looking at the higher prices they might have to pay for other origins like India, like African processors versus the risk in the supply chain. It's a difficult decision for buyers because they have become used to a relatively low priced and sometimes a lower quality price balance than in the past, but they are looking at it and they are very much focused on risk, particularly if they're not sure about demand and they're considering that the delivery time from distant processors is far greater than delivery time from processors in West Africa. That might again cause them to look in West Africa. This is not something that changes the processing in Vietnam in any major way in 2026 or 2027, but it is a factor that's influencing the market as time goes on. So let's have a look at the trade and let's see if any of these conclusions are finding a basis in actual trends of trade. So first of all, we looked at really good indicator, really good bellwether for the cashew trade, and that is the exports from Vietnam over the months. And we looked again January, February, March. This is cumulative. It's in cashew kernels tons. And what we're seeing is that the green bars being 2026, we're actually seeing that exports in 2026 are up versus the last year by about 2.5% in the first quarter, which is very encouraging. Not near the record. The record was 2024, but still very healthy and very positive development. So a strong start in exports from Vietnam. Let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to look at the different regions. We look at China, North America, the top 10 in Europe, Middle East, and East and Central Asia, excluding China. So if we look at China, we see, first of all, that actually exports from Vietnam to China are significantly down this year. I think the year to measure against is last year, not 2024. That was something of an anomaly. China's bought a little bit less, down by 16%. Did we expect that? I think we did. I didn't think that the demand in China, as we've said on this event previously, is likely to maintain the growth that we saw last year. North America, well, the news is much better. 17% increase in shipments from Vietnam to North American destinations between January and March. This is significant. Looks like that the absence of import tariffs, maybe an improvement in demand, is returning American imports to pretty positive areas. So we have the stocks that may have been built up ahead of tariffs have been exhausted. Tariffs were removed in November. And despite there's been a lot of issues, let's say, to be sorted out around the removal of tariffs, demand so far looks quite positive. If we look in Europe, steady growth, something that you would really expect to see. Again, 3.6% growth. That's slightly above last year, slightly below the average, but still pretty positive. And again, particularly in the European Union, very strong growth in demand for cashew kernels. Middle East, well, if we look at the top six, no surprise that it's well down. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Middle East in a moment. Overall imports to the region down by 34%, no surprise in that. And if we look in East and Central Asia, 18% increase. So what we're seeing overall is a small increase in exports, but it varies across the regions. The US and Canada particularly the US, is back, buying strongly again. Europe, steady growth as we've seen for many years. China's knocked back a little bit, but I don't find that surprising because you can not grow at the rate of last year every year. In fact, I recall at the World Cashew Conference, Chinese delegates pretty much told us that, and the Middle East hurt. So let's have a look at the Middle Eastern markets just to get some idea of A, how important they are, and B, what's been going on in terms of shipments and what that might mean. So here's just an overview of sort of Central Asia, Middle Eastern markets. Point out, many of these markets are supplied through UAE, and where products come to UAE, big import and big export, and they're distributed to other countries. There is also a trend now, short term, but also a longer term trend toward distribution via Turkey. Many Turkish companies are coming into the cashew business and reselling products not only in Turkey, which potentially is a huge consumer, but also in other countries throughout the region. If we look at this, we see the entire region, by my calculation, is about 9% of world imports, which obviously is significant, and it's fast growing. If we look at the growth in this region over the last 5 years, it's about 7.7% per annum. So these markets are significant. Loss of these markets is important. So let's have a look and see what's happened. So if we look, first of all, I've taken 5 countries that are important and reported by Vietnam Customs in their short-term figures: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Kuwait, and Iraq. What we can see is, first of all, United Arab Emirates, no surprise, big fall in sales during the first quarter. In fact, really, we say the first quarter, but January and February were fine. What's happened is that shipments stopped in March. And I think we can expect the same thing in the month of April. So this is a loss of market. Saudi Arabia in March down by half, UAE basically gone, Kuwait and Iraq also gone, and for obvious reasons. First quarter, so it started quite good. You would have thought that the overall performance of these markets in 2026 would be good. We would have expected growth, but this demand is not coming back. So key seasonal demand has been lost. In 2025, these 5 markets between them imported 59,000 tons of cashew kernels. That's what, about 250,000 tons equivalent raw cashew nuts just from Vietnam. They also buy from India. They also buy from Africa. And the Middle East as a region imported a total of 89,000 tons. So damaging these markets is important. It's about 9% of world demand. So it does have an impact. But so far this year, that impact has been offset by improvements, particularly in North America, but also in Europe. So what we're seeing is really a drop in requirements. If this continues, probably a drop in requirements of raw cashew nuts of about 250,000 tons. That tends to offset some of the loss of the crop in West Africa. Other demand factors that we should bear in mind: firstly, pistachio. So Iran is a major supplier of pistachio to the world. Pistachio prices are at 8-year highs. Pistachio is important for snack nuts that will tend to support demand in India and, of course, in Europe, possibly in China too, over the foreseeable future, let's say. Almonds, again, quite good news in almonds. Disrupted season, but stronger than expected shipments. Estimates were pessimistic. Interestingly, the US, the Common Almond Board of California, now tells us that about 75% of the crop is sold. But interestingly, US domestic shipments are down by 17%. So there we have a positive signal in terms of overall shipments of almonds. Europe has been positive especially, but a negative signal in terms of US domestic demand. Another mixed signal in the business. Probably less significant, but also interesting is that EU, a big market, EU imports are down by 8% on last year. Now, that's overall food imports. That's not cashew imports. I do not have EU figures just yet. They take a while to put the figures together. But shipments from Vietnam are up. So I don't think this applies to cashews, but it is a signal, and it is something we need to just keep an eye on. If we look at the overall economic outlook, we saw figures from the IMF. And I read Reuters for these information, find it very well presented. Um, Economic outlook is certainly dented in almost everywhere by the war in the Middle East. And that's not something that goes away very quickly. If the war ended right now, there would still be an impact. There would still be an economic impact. Not as bad, but there will be an economic impact of this. Look back to 2022. When did that become apparent? It became apparent from July onwards. So we need to look closely at this. And I'll just throw one small thing in at the end of this, which is there is a high chance reported in National Geographic from good scientific sources, a high chance of a very strong or a strong El Nino in 2026. That would impact harvests in 2027. So that means probably in southern producing countries, drought. It can also mean rains, strong rains. Last time around, we had an impact in Cambodia. That was before Cambodia became a big producer, of course. Cambodia, Vietnam was impacted by heavy rains. African countries were impacted by droughts. So something to look out for. Early days, they say they'll have a proper forecast on that by July, August, and we'll be watching that and we'll be talking about it and its potential impact in 2027 in later events. So let's have a look then at the outlook for 2026 or the revised outlook for 2026. We think that the higher costs in the market tend to support the price of cashew kernels, particularly. We see farm gate prices as remaining steady. We see the lower quality increases processor costs, mainly applicable in West African countries, but also in Vietnam when those supplies reach there. If you get a lower yield, it's a higher cost of processing. We think that the demand in China and particularly India will in the short term remain quite slow due to the impact of the energy price increases, probably more balanced impact of energy prices this time. We talked about back in 2022, the influence was mainly felt in Western countries. It'll be more balanced around the world. Now, the Western dependence on oil from the Middle East has been reduced, or oil through the Straits of Hormuz at least has been reduced, but India and China will be impacted. That may well slow demand a little bit. It may mean that consumers are more cautious and that they may come to market a little bit later. It's a thought. It's not a fact. That can change. This may be settled by the time peak demand periods come around again in those markets. I still think that the raw cashew price is out of line, and despite higher costs, it's out of line with kernels. And that's probably because the crops are slow to market. So if there is volatility in the market, I feel that's where it's likely to be. As more product comes to market, raw cashew nut prices may start to slow down a little bit. They may start to come down in line with kernels. It seems unlikely to me that kernels prices will correct to meet raw cashew nuts, much more likely the opposite, for the time being at least, until we know the impact on demand of the oil price hikes, the impact in particularly the major markets, China, India, European Union, and the United States. I think we're probably looking at price stability, but if we get a big hit on demand, it could cause prices to slip later in the season. I don't think we'll know that till the second half of the year, but we do need to follow it closely. So let's hope in the meantime, for all kinds of reasons, obviously not just economic, that we get a settlement to the war in the Middle East. So there you have it. That's 15th of April. That's what I'm thinking about the cashew market. That's what we're seeing. That's the analysis for now. Let me pass you back to Isaac and see if anyone has any interesting comments or questions. Isaac.
All right, Jim, thank you very much for your presentation. We have a few questions here. The first one is from Amadou Balde, and he wants to know why they have not been mention of Senegal in the last two sessions. Is it because of low production levels, or it's simply because there's lack of national data collection services for the cashew sector in Senegal?
No, neither. It's because of time. So when we get round to the Senegal crop in full flow and we get a little bit more advanced into the season, we'll focus in more on that part of the world. We'll focus more on Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and Gambia, of course. Just simply time of year. We'll come to it in the coming weeks.
Okay. Then another question here to know what is happening in the Burkina Faso. Are there any indications on when the export window would open?
We're waiting for information. It should be open according to the original documents. And I think on paper it is open, but I think we're waiting for updates on that. I've been trying to contact people to get a good update on the situation there. I got an update on the processors, as I mentioned during the presentation. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that is pretty slow to come to market until the processors get themselves fully supplied. So I don't have a straight answer on that. We will definitely have something within the next 2 weeks.
There is another question here. Due to geopolitical issues, many Middle East buyers are facing problems to release their import consignments of cashew kernels. At the same time, no signal of drifting down on the price of cashew kernels. It is confirmed that the quality and quantity of RCN is less in the ongoing season. While attributing all these reasons, thus the price of RCN and cashew kernels may continue to firm up further. We want to know whether prices of RCN and kernel will continue to firm up.
I don't personally see that cashew kernels will firm further, at least not in any significant way. Um, I don't think that the shortage of supply is enough to drive a significant increase in cashew kernels prices. I think that raw cashew nuts are probably a little bit overpriced at the moment, and that are more likely to come down to meet the cashew kernels price. Pretty much what happened last year. Um, I don't think that the drop in production is hugely significant, given that we're also going to see a question mark over demand for the rest of the year. So it's an interesting point, and it's something that we will come back to again during the next session. So thanks for that, Garesh.
All right. Another question here. Isn't it worrying that countries like Cote d'Ivoire are already reducing support for processors, considering processing levels are still largely below target? What is accounting for this?
Well, okay. This is interesting. So first of all, are they below target? Is the target, I think, is 50% of the crop processed by 2030. Um, they're not quite there. I think they're something like 30%, 31%, I think it was forecast for this year. It's pretty good going. There have been significant supports by way of the subsidy in place since 2018. Bear in mind that was a revolutionary move by the government of Cote d'Ivoire in partnership with the World Bank, and they supported processors hugely. Clearly, that cannot continue forever. They have reduced subsidies. They've essentially, I think it's 60% plus reduction for internationally owned companies, a little bit less of a reduction for domestically owned companies. So I don't think it's surprising that they have reduced it. What has been shown is that, firstly, processing in Cote d'Ivoire can work. which wasn't always the case. People didn't always believe that. Many people would have said 10 years ago that processing in Africa cannot work. That's been shown to be incorrect. It can, and it does. Secondly, you cannot subsidize forever. There will be some people definitely cause problems by it because they've come to rely on subsidies or because they invested and expected the subsidies to continue. So maybe if there are issues, they might be around the communication of how the changes were brought in rather than the fact. I think that it will probably slow the investment down a little bit, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if the target of 50% processing by 2030 was met. But again, let's just underline one thing. The crop that was envisaged in 2018 is much less than the crop that was envisaged for 2026 back in 2018, was much less than the actual crop. So back in those days, we expected, I think, in 2018 that production would reach something like 1.2, just speaking from memory, about 1.25 million tons. But last year it reached 1.55 million tons. So the production is a little bit better. So reaching the target therefore becomes a little bit more challenging. And production is going to continue to grow. So I do think processing continues to grow. I think it grows a little bit more slowly. I think businesses focus much more on their profitability and the management of their business in the future. But definitely short term, yeah, it will. Certainly short term, it will have an impact. It will make people pause and maybe they'll do their business planning a little bit better for the future. Isaac.
All right. We have a few more questions.
Good.
How is the future outlook of demand? The Middle East will be surely impacted due to the war, but what about the US and China? Will demand remain consistent for the rest of the year?
I think that there's likely to be an impact of the war. I mean, war has sent oil prices sky high. Oil prices still have a significant impact on cost of living in those countries. They have a significant impact on consumer confidence in those countries. If you look at the price of petrol in the United States, it's still cheap by our standards, but it has gone sky high. And that's going to remind people every time that they look at their fuel gauge that prices are higher, and that may well have an impact. I think similarly in China, you could see a similar situation. So we did not expect that China would grow at the same rate this year as it did last year. We didn't think that was possible, and I think that's probably going to prove to be the case. Um, Therefore, I think that there will be an improvement in US demand on last year as the market naturally adjusts, but that it will not be as positive as it might have been. In China, I think there's a question mark over the rate of growth. Long-term trends for the consumption of cashew nuts are really strong, really positive. This year might be an exception. I don't think that leads to any particular um, massive, we saw in 2022 a significant drop in imports in several countries, but we didn't see a huge drop in the overall imports. I think it was only down by about 2% overall. Isaac.
Okay. And a question. Considering the blockage of RCN trade due to various West African country policies, do you think this will result in an uptick in Burma kernels trade from West Africa to Vietnam?
That's an interesting one, isn't it?
Okay. Okay.
Okay, well, yes, it did lead to an uptick in Burma kernels last year. Will it do the same? I don't think so. I think there is something of a certain amount of resistance in Vietnam now. to Burma kernels. And therefore, I think that probably that trade may well slow down a little bit. I don't think that it's particularly linked to the raw cashew nut trade, but I do think that Burma kernels remains a significant issue. So maintenance, yes. Uptick, I don't think so. It was huge last year. I think they reported something like 100,000 tons in Vietnam imported as Burma kernels. I guess many processors feel they might have had enough of that and they would rather see raw cashew nuts come in. Vietnam's well supplied right now. The supplies are there. The problem is the price of raw cashew nuts. Would it make sense? It'd make sense on the pure calculation to ship more Burma kernels to Vietnam. Would it make sense in terms of its long-term impact? I don't think so. Not for African countries. It would probably cause the slowing down of the development of processing. Isaac.
All right, Jim. The next session will be on 29th April 2026. That will be in 2 weeks. What should we expect in the next 2 weeks?
I guess we're the next 2 weeks we're going to see whether or not these second crops in Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea start to come online, whether that flows. I think it will. We'll see how that flows. We'll see how Burkina Faso handles its export situation. And we'll see whether or not we get more interest from processors in buying raw cashew nuts. I don't think we'll see a lot of action on the cashew kernels markets over the next 2 weeks. When we come back in 2 weeks, which will bring us to the end of April, incredibly, we probably will still be in the midst of a rather slow and delayed crop. So we'll continue to have a look at that. We'll also know by that stage whether or not we're going to get a fast resolution to the war in the Middle East, and we'll have a look at what that might mean for demand. And overall, I think we might start to, as we get towards the end of the 2026 harvest season, we might start to have a look at some of the long-term trends in supply and demand in cashews. But for now, thanks everyone. It's a real pleasure to get this opportunity to talk cashews. And particularly thank you for your questions. And to you, Isaac, thanks a million for hosting the event. Best to yourself and your colleagues
All right.
at the African Cashew
Okay.
Updates.
All right. Thank you very much, Jim, for this insightful presentation. Before we go there, participants, remember that online registration for the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place in Accra, Ghana, is open. Register now and enjoy up to 40% discount on all conference rates. We also acknowledge the support of our sponsors and partners, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, the GIZ Move from Cashew Project, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Thank you very much for participating in today's session. See you again in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.